I'll pass it over to Adam Hilton.
Okay, thank you. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay. So let me just first reiterate what David said at the beginning of and express my thanks to the organizing committee for all the work they did to put such a fabulous thing together. I guess to begin with my personal reflection, I think I first communicated with Leo via email in the fall of 2008. I think it was about the height of the breaking of the crisis. I was living in Germany at the time, and I sent you an email saying, given what's going on, I'd like to come study. And Leo, of course, replied very graciously and said, well, I'll do what I can. And then, surprise, surprise, I ended up as his graduate assistant, which is probably no coincidence. But looking back, and actually thanks to the storage of digital data, I still have that email. And I looked it up, and I rather brazenly finished that initial communication with saying, I think you and I will be really good friends. Yeah. And while I'm a little embarrassed to share that, we have become good friends. And you've been a fabulous mentor to me, and a great teacher, and someone who inspires me, and also a fantastic neighbor. And one of my claims to fame is of all the many clingy graduate students you've had, I don't know how many have moved in to the flat across the street from your house, which both you and Melanie were so accommodating of my continual presence on your doorstep. And also, you both brought me chicken soup when I had pneumonia. So, in addition to being great people, just fabulous neighbors. So, my thanks to both of you for everything. Okay. So once upon a time, Marxian political economy invested socialists the world over not only with an understanding of the dynamics of capitalism as a mode of production, but also with an optimism that the operation of capitalism would prepare the grounds for its eventual replacement with socialism. On the one hand, capitalist accumulation was inherently unstable and prone to mounting crises. On the other hand, the very operation of the system simplified and drew together masses of proletarians into ready-made relations of production through which they could build solidaristic bonds, class consciousness, and assertive forms of self-defense. In both terms of structure and agency, capitalism created its own gravediggers. Now, if that optimism was always a little misplaced, due in part to the propagandistic nature of some of Marx's writings, it is not all necessarily his fault. On the contrary, plenty of other Marxist passages gave us every reason to expect that capitalism disorganizes workers as a class via labor market competition and atrophies their civic capacities as decision-making concerning the collective good is concentrated in the actions of investors and private consumption is determined by market forces. Indeed, it is precisely because class consciousness and solidarity do not develop spontaneously from the economic processes of capitalist development that Marx and Engels assign the critical role of forming the proletariat into a class to the Communist Party. Now, in recognition of this tension, that capitalism on the one hand prepares the foundation for socialism, but on the other underdevelops the agency of the proletariat, Leo's work has foregrounded what he has called the problematic of working class capacities as a theoretical gap in Marxian political economy, as well as a practical problem for socialists. The capacity of workers to think, strategize, and act as a collective force cannot be taken for granted, as it so often has been in such classical questions as why is there no socialism in the United States? Such teleological inquiries often reduce to investigations of what factor or set of factors impeded the natural development of proletarian consciousness in this or that working class. Leo's work, for me, has turned this line of inquiry on its head. If workers' class capacities are degraded by capitalism, and it is the role of political and ideological structures, such as the party, to build them, then it is to the nature of those institutions, their possibilities, their limits, and contradictions that we must look if we want to understand the past and future potential for workers to act as collective agents. Class capacities are ultimately political constructions, that take shape within the constraints and opportunities of history and political economy, as agents develop institutions that attempt to fashion proletarians into a class. While class location in the social structure is objective, class consciousness and interests are historical, subjective, and contradictory, formed as they are by pragmatically constructed institutions and ideologies that aim to help people make rough sense of their everyday experiences. Parties, therefore, do not merely reflect the interests of the working class as much as they shape those interests. We tend to think of workers as either being organized, and therefore maybe revolutionary, or unorganized, and therefore the victims of false consciousness. But in fact, people who work for a living are always organized, even if they are so in ways that disorganize their ability to act as a class. Workers can be mobilized on the basis of the masses, the people, consumers, taxpayers, citizens, Americans, or simply Democrats and Republicans. As Gramsci pointed out, parties play active and creative roles in structuring what he called a collective will. Leo's scholarship on the class politics of the British Labour Party has illustrated the constitutive role of working class institutions. As a party dedicated to gaining a seat at the table rather than changing the game being played, the Labour Party and all social democratic parties staked its legitimacy as a responsible party of government on its ability to deliver labor, peace, and class harmony. It was this commitment to parliamentarism and corporatist management of capitalist social relations that imposed ultimately insurmountable obstacles to the new left inside the Labour Party, which sought to democratize the party and recommit the party to transforming society in the midst of the breakdown of the social democratic order. Now, I've tried to apply some of these insights of Leo's work on the other side of the pond, so to speak, in the US context. The major difference, of course, is that the US is alone among advanced capitalist democracies in never producing a labor party. While this is a development to be regretted, for sure, I've nonetheless found his insights illuminating in my own cross-examination of the class politics of the Democratic Party. Most of the time, when a Marxist is queried about the nature of the Democratic Party, we say that it's a bourgeois party. While this characterization is often perfectly appropriate for debates in the pub over beer, or maybe at a socialist meeting, its analytical foundations are not so clear. What actually makes a bourgeois party bourgeois, especially in the absence of a rival party that explicitly identifies itself as working class? Is it its personnel? Is it its platform? Is it its social base? Or perhaps maybe the policy preferences of its donor class? I think all these factors are significant and worthy of consideration, but what I want to draw out is an overlooked aspect that Leo's work has cued me into. And that is what makes the Democratic Party bourgeois, if you want to use that expression, is the effect of its form of organization. Parties were never supposed to exist in the United States, at least according to its most prominent founders. However, as enduring conflicts within the first generation of US political elites took shape, these competing factions built organizations to mobilize blocks of supporters in the newly enfranchised working class. Their material basis and patronage saved American parties from having to build mass memberships, and their decentralized structure allowed the flexibility for local and state organizations to fashion majorities out of whatever social materials they found at the ready. Southern Democrats, for instance, could be racist and xenophobic, while Northern Democrats targeted their appeals to African Americans and newly arriving immigrants. The point is that party development in the US emerged from the top down, from the state into civil society, for the purpose of assisting elites in their pursuit of voters. It should be no surprise that such thinly institutionalized and skeletal organizations are not well organized for participatory democracy, or for educating working people to think and act as a class. However, precisely because they are so hollow, American party organizations are especially dependent on outside sources of money, volunteers, and social networks, which can be used for electoral purposes. This has certainly given large donors privileged access to party officials and office holders, but it has also provided a relatively permeable opportunity structure for the entry of social movements and other well-organized groups. Thus, when the trade union movement exploded in the 1930s, the CIO forged an enduring alliance with liberal Democrats who exchanged policy influence for the CIO's ready-made voter mobilization infrastructure. Operating as a surrogate campaign organization, labor was integrated into the party's grassroots organizations and gained privileged veto power over its presidential nominees. But the way in which trade unions were embedded in networks of elite brokerage created powerful disincentives for labor to educate and mobilize their own rank and file to support the social democratic agenda that the labor leadership was pursuing in Washington. Unions became very good at turning out the vote of their members and non-members at election time. But between elections, unions had little capacity nor inclination to transform workers into socialists, social democrats, or even in some cases, liberals. Moreover, the position of union influence in the party's smoke-filled rooms served as a powerful base of resistance against the efforts of the New Politics movement, the New Left in the Democratic Party, to democratize that party in the 1960s and 70s. The legacy of the union's pattern of rank-and-file demobilization had left many unions unprepared or unwilling to exert influence through the party's more open presidential nominating process. The effect was not just a confirmation of the stereotypical labor bureaucrat for many New Left activists, but the limitation of the party reform movement and its agenda to build a different kind of Democratic Party. Now, I think this analysis has several interesting implications. If what makes a party bourgeois is its disorganizing effect on the working class, then we may want to rethink the common observation that the absence of a working class party in the US is one of its trademark claims for exceptional status. On the contrary, as European social democracy has developed into neoliberalism with a human face, we might think of US parties as being more exemplary of a 21st century trend rather than a case of comparative exceptionalism. Now, when Leo and I started thinking through a lot of these questions in a reading course we did called Working Class Politics in Capitalist Democracies, we often, before transcending pessimism, would become mired in it by reading Roberta Michel's and Duverger and classic texts like that. And we would eventually get to asking ourselves the question, as you put yesterday, Leo, can the party serve as a vehicle for the development of the working class? Does party organization, its electoral activity, its legislative behavior mitigate that party's ability to develop class consciousness and democratic capacities? Tentatively, with these questions in mind, I've speculated about the potential and the prospects of the left divorcing the twin tasks traditionally assigned to the working class party, separating the organization of the proletariat into the class from the imperative to win governmental power. Both are, of course, indispensable activities that cannot take place in isolation from each other. Organizing workers as voters does not in itself build class capacities, and class power that fails to become state power also fails to change the world. But perhaps socialists have erred in investing both imperatives in a single organizational vehicle. A division of labor that specializes on grassroots organizing through nationally networked community centers centered around working class life could not only be used to educate and empower workers, but could also function as an instrument for applying pressure on parties that are not of our own making. If indeed the US bourgeois model of party is becoming generalized, this may be one of the only options for the left to transcend pessimism in the foreseeable future. Thank you.